The first time I realized something was wrong in our Boston home was the moment my daughter-in-law lowered her voice when I walked into the room. I still remember how the snow looked outside that evening. Thick white flakes drifted slowly past the tall windows of our brownstone in Beacon Hill, covering the sidewalks and parked cars beneath the glow of old street lamps. Boston winters always carried a certain silence with them, the kind that made every sound inside a house feel louder than it really was. The ticking grandfather clock in the hallway, the soft hiss of the fireplace, the quiet murmur of voices stopping the second someone entered the room. I stood in the kitchen holding a tray of coffee cups when I noticed James and Olivia near the living room window. My son had his hands in his pockets, shoulders tense beneath his navy sweater, while Olivia leaned close beside him speaking softly enough that I could not hear the words. The moment they noticed me, both of them went quiet. Olivia smiled first. She always smiled first. "Margaret," she said warmly, smoothing a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "We were just talking about Christmas plans." Christmas plans. Such harmless words. But something about the way James avoided my eyes made my stomach tighten. "That sounds important," I replied calmly as I set the tray down on the dining table. Olivia crossed the room gracefully, the soft heels of her boots clicking against hardwood floors Richard and I had refinished together nearly 20 years ago. "We just think it may be easier to host Christmas at our place this year," she said lightly. "Your house is beautiful, but winter can be exhausting for you." There it was. Tiny, polite, sharp enough to leave a mark anyway. "Winter can be exhausting for you." I smiled faintly while pouring coffee into 3 cups. "I have managed 68 Boston winters just fine." James laughed softly, though it sounded nervous more than amused. "Mom, she only means you should not overwork yourself." I handed him his coffee carefully and studied his face for a moment. My son used to look directly at people when he spoke. Richard always admired that about him. A man who can hold. "Eye contact usually has nothing to hide," he used to say. Lately, James spent more time staring at floors, coffee mugs, windows, anywhere except the people talking to him. Outside, snow continued falling across Charles Street, while warm yellow lights reflected against icy sidewalks below. Our home had stood there for nearly 90 years, tall and narrow like most old Boston brownstones, filled with creaking staircases, built-in bookshelves, and memories pressed into every corner. Richard and I bought it when James was only 6 years old. We could barely afford it back then. I still remember eating canned soup for nearly a year while we saved enough money to replace the leaking roof. But slowly, over decades, that house became more than wood and brick. It became birthdays, graduations, Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across Persian rugs. Home. Real home. Olivia wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and glanced around the living room. "This place really is incredible," she said softly. "Homes like this in Boston are impossible to find now." I noticed the way she said homes instead of family homes. Another tiny detail most people would ignore. But over the last year, I had started noticing many tiny details about Olivia. The way she asked about property taxes during Thanksgiving dinner. The way she casually mentioned how much similar homes sold for in our neighborhood. The way she slowly repositioned herself at the center of every family tradition without anyone fully realizing it. At first, I blamed myself for being suspicious. Grief changes people. Richard had passed away 14 months earlier after 41 years of marriage, and there were days I still reached for him in bed before remembering the emptiness beside me was permanent now. Everyone told me loss could make ordinary things feel threatening. Maybe they were right. But deep down, I knew this feeling was something else entirely. "I found a wonderful condo building near the harbor last week," Olivia said suddenly while sipping her coffee. "Very quiet. Beautiful security. Heated underground parking." James shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Olivia," but she continued, smiling as though the conversation remained perfectly normal. "I just thought someone in your stage of life might enjoy less maintenance." Someone in your stage of life. Another elegant little insult hidden beneath concern. I looked toward the staircase where family photographs lined the wall all the way to the second floor. James in Little League uniforms. Richard teaching Lily how to ride a bicycle along the Charles River path. Christmas portraits stretching back nearly 3 decades. "Richard built this family inside these walls," I said quietly. Olivia's smile flickered slightly before returning. "Of course, and nobody can take that away." But the strange thing about manipulative people is that they often reveal themselves through what they choose to mention without being asked. Because I had not said anyone was trying to take anything away. Yet somehow, Olivia already sounded defensive. The fire crackled softly in the living room while snow drifted heavier outside. And standing there inside the warm house Richard spent 41 years building with me, I realized something cold had quietly entered our home long before winter ever arrived. After the tension in the kitchen, I moved toward the living room where the glow of the fireplace highlighted the polished wood floors and rows of framed family photographs lining the walls. James followed slowly behind, shoulders tense, the soft hum of the heater filling the background with warmth that felt oddly at odds with the chill in the air. Olivia had already arranged herself on the sofa with her legs crossed, a carefully composed smile plastered across her face, holding a cup of tea that steamed lightly in the low light. "Margaret, why do you always make such a fuss over small details?" she asked gently, the words designed to seem innocent, but I recognized the subtle edge hidden beneath. I set down my coat and purse, folding my hands calmly in my lap, and met her gaze steadily. "Small details build a lifetime," I replied softly. Richard believed the little things mattered most. James shifted uncomfortably on the rug beside the coffee table, eyes darting between us, the lines of stress around his mouth deepening. As he tried not to take sides out loud, Olivia tilted her head slightly, as though studying me, testing boundaries that I had no intention of conceding. "We all want what is best for this family," she said smoothly, the words echoing through the high ceilings and casting long shadows across the room. "Sometimes that means making adjustments for the future." Adjustments. Every word she carefully selected carried multiple layers, implying I was out of touch, overprotective, or simply an obstacle to her carefully planned vision of our home. I smiled faintly, acknowledging her control of conversation but refusing to yield to it. "The future is built on trust and respect," I said softly, letting the firelight flicker across my face and emphasizing the steadiness in my voice. Outside, the Boston wind pressed against the windows, rattling them gently, while snow continued to coat the streets and sidewalks in a thick white blanket, muffling distant traffic and footsteps. The contrast between the quiet chaos outside and the calculated calm inside felt almost cinematic. "James, do you agree with me?" Olivia asked casually, though every syllable was designed to force a response, to create alignment where there should have been none. James glanced at me briefly, the decision evident in the subtle tightening of his jaw. "Mom is right," he said quietly, not to argue, but to bridge the fragile gap between us. Olivia's smile widened slightly, sensing the partial victory, yet I saw the faint flicker of unease in her eyes. "I want only what is good for all of us," she continued. "Surely you understand that." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my tone calm but resolute, each word deliberate. "I also understand the value of history, memories, and the home we built together as a family. No amount of planning or adjustment can replace that." The air seemed to thicken as our words hung between us, balancing tension and truth, the weight of decades of family tradition pressing down quietly yet palpably. James shifted again, leaning forward on the edge of the coffee table, his hands clasped tightly, and I noticed the familiar traits of my son, the boy who once spent entire afternoons building model ships in this very living room, now grown, caught between loyalty and caution. "Margaret, sometimes we overthink," Olivia said softly, her voice smooth, trying to re-establish composure, but the edge of impatience surfaced as her hand tapped gently against the teacup. I leaned back slightly, studying the firelight flicker over her expression, recognizing the calculated calm hiding behind practiced poise. "Overthinking," I repeated. "Perhaps. Or perhaps simply noticing things you would prefer others overlooked." The room was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the fire and the wind brushing against the panes outside. For the first time that evening, Olivia paused, adjusting her posture, clearly considering the challenge posed by a matriarch who had weathered storms of family, life, and loss, and who now stood firmly in her own clarity. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth anchor me, while James exhaled, shoulders sagging slightly, as though the truth of long-observed manipulations had finally begun to sink in. "Margaret, you always see more than anyone," He murmured quietly, not accusing, merely acknowledging. And I nodded, aware that understanding was often the first step toward resolution, and that tonight, in our Boston home, those quiet realizations had begun to shape a shift long overdue, a subtle reclaiming of balance and presence, ensuring that the bonds of family, history, and memory would not be quietly replaced by polished words or gentle manipulations. The following morning, the house felt unusually quiet, the kind of silence that settles heavily after uncomfortable truths begin surfacing. I woke before sunrise, wrapped myself in Richard's old wool cardigan, and stood near the kitchen window watching the first pale light spread across the snow-covered rooftops of Beacon Hill. The city outside looked peaceful, almost untouched, but inside our home I could feel tension lingering in every room like smoke after a fire. The coffee maker hummed softly as I prepared breakfast, the familiar scent of dark roast filling the kitchen while memories drifted through my mind without permission. Richard standing by the stove making pancakes. Every Christmas morning, James laughing as a boy while snow boots dried beside the radiator. The sound of family conversations echoing through the dining room late into the night. For decades, this home carried warmth naturally. No effort, no strategy, just love woven quietly into ordinary routines. Now every interaction felt measured, calculated. Around 8 o'clock, I heard footsteps descending the staircase. James entered first, wearing gray sweatpants and a tired expression that made him look older than 38. He poured himself coffee silently before finally glancing toward me. "You are up early," he muttered softly. I smiled faintly. Boston mothers do not sleep late during snowstorms. He almost laughed at that, though guilt still shadowed his face from the night before. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The heater clicked on in the hallway while snow slid quietly down the edges of the window panes outside. Finally, James leaned against the counter and exhaled heavily. "Mom, Olivia did not mean to upset you." There it was again, the instinct to soften everything, to smooth over sharp truths before anyone had to face them honestly. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee and kept my voice calm. "Your wife spends a great deal of time discussing my future inside this house." James rubbed one hand across the back of his neck. "She just worries about stability." Stability. Such a polished word for control. I studied my son carefully, noticing how exhausted he looked beneath the warm kitchen lights. James had always hated conflict. Even as a child, he tried keeping peace between classmates, teachers, neighbors, anyone around him. Olivia understood that about him better than anyone. And people who understand your weaknesses can quietly build entire systems around them. Before I could respond, Olivia entered the kitchen wearing cream-colored lounge clothes and carrying her phone in one hand. Her expression brightened instantly the moment she saw us talking. "Good morning," she said smoothly. She crossed the room and kissed James lightly on the cheek before opening the refrigerator. Everything about her movements felt practiced, controlled. Even her smiles arrived at perfect moments. "The roads are terrible today," she continued casually while scrolling through her phone. "Half the city is practically shut down." I nodded once. Boston survives snow better than most places. Olivia smiled politely, but kept her eyes on the screen. True. Though honestly, I cannot imagine managing a house this size alone during winters anymore. There it was again. Always subtle. Always wrapped inside concern. James shifted uncomfortably beside the counter. I noticed it immediately. He noticed it too. Olivia, however, continued speaking as though nothing unusual had happened. "Actually," she added lightly, "I was reading about luxury senior condos near the harbor this morning. They offer private transportation, cleaning services, even medical staff on site." I set my coffee cup down carefully. The sound echoed softly against the granite countertop. "You seem very invested in where I live." Olivia finally looked up from her phone, smiling again with perfect calm. "I just think people deserve comfort." Comfort. Another elegant disguise for displacement. I turned slightly toward the hallway where framed photographs stretched up the staircase wall. Richard holding newborn James wrapped in a hospital blanket. Our family standing together at Fenway Park during a summer game nearly 15 years earlier. Lily in her graduation cap smiling beside me on the front porch. History lived inside those photographs. Real history, not something transferable through marriage papers or polite conversations about property values. "Comfort," I repeated softly, comes from feeling wanted somewhere. The kitchen grew still after that. Even the heater seemed quieter now. Olivia held my gaze for a moment too long before finally looking away first. Tiny details reveal far more than arguments ever do. James stared down into his coffee cup as though searching for answers at the bottom of it. Then, unexpectedly, my phone buzzed against the counter beside me. A text message from Lily. "Grandma, can I come by later? I need to tell you something about Olivia." My stomach tightened instantly, though I kept my expression neutral. Olivia was still standing, only a few feet away, humming softly while rearranging fruit in a decorative bowl near the center island. Completely composed, completely confident. I slipped the phone back into my pocket quietly and looked out the window toward the snow-covered street below. Somewhere deep inside me, a cold realization had already begun taking shape. Whatever secrets existed inside this family, they were larger than awkward conversations about Christmas dinners or future housing plans. And for the first time since Richard died, I realized I was no longer simply observing tension inside our home. I was standing at the edge of something far more deliberate. By mid-morning, the Boston sunlight filtered softly through the tall living room windows, dusting the hardwood floors with pale gold. Yet the warmth of the light did little to ease the chill of uncertainty that had settled over the house. I sat in the high-backed armchair Richard once favored, the fabric still carrying faint impressions of his presence, sipping lukewarm coffee and studying the room carefully. Every piece of furniture, every framed photograph, every subtle decoration seemed to speak of a life lived meticulously, of a home built on decades of love and attention. Olivia moved around the living room with deliberate ease, placing cushions, adjusting throws, her actions small but precise, as though she were leaving her mark on every corner she passed. James lingered near the window, watching the snow drift down the street below, his hands clasped together, his expression conflicted. He had never liked confrontation, but the tension between his wife and mother had reached a threshold he could no longer ignore silently. "Martha, you seem tense this morning," Olivia said lightly, turning to face me with a smile that attempted ease but could not hide the calculation behind it. I set my coffee down carefully, meeting her gaze evenly. "Tense? Perhaps. Or perhaps simply aware of the house I spent decades building," I said softly, letting the weight of the words settle. Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying me, weighing my tone. "It is only because we want to ensure you have the comfort you deserve," she replied. The words polished, carefully chosen, though their undertone implied control rather than care. Outside, the soft snow muffled distant city sounds, and the only audible noises were the faint hum of the radiator and the occasional clink of a teacup in the kitchen. James shifted his weight slightly, glancing from Olivia to me, the quiet indecision visible in the tight line of his jaw. I continued, "Comfort is best achieved when it comes from understanding and respect, not from imposed adjustments or suggestions masked as kindness." Olivia's smile faltered for a brief instant before she re-established her composure. "Of course, we all wish to preserve tradition while still making life easier for you," she said, setting down a small stack of holiday invitations on the coffee table. I noticed how she emphasized preserving tradition without truly including the past memories and emotional connections that defined it. That was the subtle pattern I had learned to detect over the past year, noticing how her words, gestures, and suggestions always sought to redirect focus away from the foundations of our home and family life. "James, are you comfortable with these adjustments?" Olivia asked, glancing at her husband, her voice gentle yet probing. He hesitated, and I saw him internally weighing the ease of peace against the discomfort of watching his mother's space being gradually encroached upon. We need to consider everyone," he said finally, his voice quiet, a soft acknowledgement of the delicate balance he wished to maintain. I let the words hang in the room for a moment, the pause filled with unspoken observations, the tension palpable yet restrained. The sun shifted, casting new angles of light across the room, highlighting the careful organization of bookshelves, the framed photographs of birthdays, graduations, and family vacations, each a testament to the life Richard and I had built. I leaned back slightly, letting my hands rest in my lap, focusing on calm, measured observation rather than reaction. Olivia, sensing that her usual influence was limited in this space, continued speaking, suggesting plans for upcoming family gatherings, subtly weaving proposals for her own preferences within the fabric of ordinary conversation. I watched each word carefully, noting how even ordinary statements could carry multiple intentions, how politeness could disguise manipulation, and how subtlety could shift dynamics before anyone fully realized it. James sighed quietly, clearly feeling the weight of divided loyalty, while I remained still, the quiet observer anchored by decades of experience, aware that patience, measured words, and calm awareness were far more effective than confrontation. As morning progressed, the snow outside continued to fall, soft and unhurried, blanketing the streets in silence, while inside, every glance, every gesture, and every carefully chosen word began to reveal the true shape of influence and intention within our Boston home, a home that carried memory, history, and the quiet strength of those who had built it. That afternoon, the snowfall finally slowed, leaving the streets outside covered in thick layers of untouched white that reflected pale winter sunlight into the house. The quiet felt deceptive, almost too calm, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Olivia had gone upstairs to take a work call, and James left briefly to shovel the front steps before the temperature dropped again overnight. For the first time all day, the house belonged entirely to me. I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing coffee cups while the old radio near the counter played soft jazz in the background, the familiar music wrapping around the room like memory itself. Richard used to love afternoons like this. Snow outside, warm kitchen, music low enough to hear the fire crackling from the next room. I dried my hands slowly on a towel and glanced toward the staircase, where framed family photographs climbed upward beside the banister. The silence in the house no longer felt peaceful. It felt observant, almost watchful. My phone buzzed softly against the countertop. "Lily, Grandma, are you alone?" her message read. I replied immediately. For the moment. Less than 20 minutes later, I heard quick footsteps crossing the snowy front walkway outside before the front door opened. Lily entered carrying a canvas tote bag, her cheeks pink from the cold and snowflakes still clinging to the shoulders of her dark coat. The second she saw me, her expression tightened with relief and nervousness all at once. "Hi, sweetheart," I said softly, helping her remove her scarf. She hugged me tightly, lingering longer than usual. "Grandma," she whispered quietly near my ear. "I need to show you something before Olivia comes back downstairs." My stomach tightened instantly, though I kept my expression calm. Lily followed me into Richard's study, closing the door gently behind us. The room still looked exactly the same as the day he died. Dark walnut shelves filled with history books, his reading chair near the fireplace, a brass desk lamp casting warm light across old leather-bound journals, and paperwork stacked neatly along the desk. Lily sat down carefully across from me, gripping the straps of her tote bag tightly. "I did not know if I should tell you," she admitted softly. "But after Christmas plans started changing and Olivia kept talking about the house, she stopped speaking for a moment, clearly unsure how to continue. I waited quietly. Sometimes silence makes truth easier to speak aloud. Finally, she reached into her bag and removed a thin folder. "I accidentally saw these last week at Dad's apartment," she whispered. My pulse slowed strangely instead of quickening. Calmness often arrives right before confirmation. I opened the folder carefully. Inside sat printed real estate documents, market estimates, renovation projections, mortgage calculations. My eyes moved slowly across highlighted sections while the room seemed to grow colder around me despite the fire burning softly nearby. Then I reached the final page. Proposed resale value after transfer of ownership. Transfer of ownership. Not future planning. Not gentle concern. Not stability. Planning. Deliberate planning. "Grandma," Lily said carefully, "Olivia has been talking to realtors for months." I looked up slowly. "Does your father know?" Lily hesitated. "I think partially, but not everything." Her voice lowered further. "Olivia keeps telling him this is what is best long-term. That the house is too large for you and eventually maintenance costs will become overwhelming." The exact same phrases, repeated over and over until they sounded reasonable enough to believe. I closed the folder quietly and rested both hands against it for a long moment. Richard used to warn me about people who rehearsed concern too perfectly. "Real kindness does not sound scripted," he often said. Olivia's concern always sounded rehearsed. Every sentence polished. Every expression timed carefully. "There is more," Lily admitted softly. My chest tightened slightly. She pulled out her phone and opened several screenshots before handing it to me carefully. Messages between Olivia and a realtor. "Once Margaret agrees to move, the location alone will double our investment within a few years." Investment. There it was. Not memory. Not family legacy. Not home. Investment. I stared at the glowing screen while snow reflected faintly through the study windows beside us. 41 years of marriage. Decades of holidays. Richard's entire life poured into those walls. And somewhere along the way, Olivia stopped seeing our home as part of the family and started seeing the family as part of the property. Lily looked heartbroken, watching my expression remain calm. "Grandma, I am sorry." I reached across the desk and squeezed her hand gently. "Do not apologize for honesty." Outside the study, I suddenly heard footsteps crossing the hallway upstairs. Olivia. The timing sent a chill through the room instantly. Lily looked toward the closed study door nervously, while I calmly slid the documents back into the folder and placed it neatly beside Richard's desk lamp. Something inside me had shifted completely now. Before, I suspected manipulation. Now I understood the scale of it. This was never about helping me, never about comfort. Olivia had been quietly preparing to reposition herself at the center of this family for years, using concern and politeness as tools sharp enough to cut without leaving visible wounds. The study door handle moved slightly, then stopped. Silence settled heavily outside the room. I looked directly at the closed door and realized something cold with absolute certainty. Olivia was listening. The study remained silent for several long seconds after the door handle moved. Lily sat frozen across from me, her hands gripping the edge of the chair while the fire crackled softly beside Richard's old bookshelf. I could hear the faint sound of Olivia's footsteps outside the door, slow and measured, before they eventually retreated down the hallway again. Even the way she walked carried calculation. Nothing about Olivia ever felt accidental anymore. I waited until the upstairs bedroom door closed before finally exhaling quietly. "She heard something," Lily whispered nervously. I nodded once and carefully closed the folder containing the real estate documents. "That may not be a bad thing." Lily frowned slightly. "Grandma, she has been planning this for months." Her voice trembled with frustration now. "She talks about this house like it already belongs to her." I glanced around Richard's study slowly, letting my eyes move across the old navy leather chair near the fireplace, the brass reading lamp on the desk, the shelves filled with decades of books collected throughout our marriage. Richard used to joke that the study smelled like cedarwood, coffee, and stubborn opinions. Standing there now, I realized something important. Homes carry emotional fingerprints. That is why people who want control over them often try rewriting the emotional atmosphere first. "Olivia does not understand this house," I said softly. "She only understands ownership." Lily lowered her eyes sadly. "Dad changed after Grandpa died." That hurt because it was true. Grief creates empty spaces inside people, and empty spaces attract influence very easily. James buried himself in work after Richard passed away. Olivia stepped naturally into every emotional gap left behind. At first, it probably looked supportive, helpful, loving even. But manipulation rarely begins with obvious cruelty. It begins with comfort. I stood slowly from Richard's desk and carried the folder toward the built-in cabinet beside the fireplace. Inside sat decades of important family paperwork organized carefully in labeled boxes. Insurance policies, mortgage documents, tax records, trust agreements. Richard believed organization prevented vulnerability. "Chaos makes people careless," he always said. I suddenly understood how much Olivia had underestimated me. She saw an aging widow struggling with loneliness and loss. She never imagined Richard spent 41 years teaching me exactly how to protect what mattered. Downstairs, I heard the front door open heavily, followed by James stamping snow from his boots in the hallway. Lily immediately sat straighter while I calmly locked the cabinet and slipped the key into my sweater pocket. Moments later, James entered the study carrying cold air and snowflakes in with him. "Everything okay in here?" he asked carefully, his eyes moving between Lily and me. "Perfectly fine," I answered softly. Lily looked at him for a moment before finally speaking. "Dad, can I ask you something honestly?" James frowned slightly. "Of course." She hesitated only briefly. Did Olivia ask you to start looking into selling Grandma's house before or after Grandpa died? The room went completely still. James stared at his daughter in shock, then toward me, immediately understanding something important had already surfaced. What are you talking about? He asked quietly. Lily held his gaze steadily now. I saw the paperwork. The color drained slowly from his face. Not guilt exactly. Fear. The fear of realizing secrets had finally reached daylight. James sat down heavily in the chair opposite Richard's desk and rubbed both hands across his face. It was not supposed to become this, he muttered softly. I watched him carefully. What exactly was it supposed to become? He looked exhausted suddenly, older than he had that morning. Olivia kept saying the house was too much responsibility for you alone, he admitted quietly. She thought downsizing would make things easier for everyone. Everyone. That word again. Always everyone except the person losing their home. And did you agree with her? I asked softly. James hesitated too long before answering. At first, maybe partially. Lily looked stunned beside him. Dad. He swallowed hard and shook his head quickly. Not because I wanted the house. He struggled for the right words. After Dad died, everything felt unstable. Olivia kept talking about financial planning, future investments, long-term security. Security. Investment. Stability. Every manipulative idea wrapped carefully inside responsible-sounding language. I sat down slowly beside the desk and folded my hands calmly in my lap. James, I said quietly, do you know why this house survived for nearly 90 years? He looked at me silently. Because generations of people treated it like a home before they treated it like an asset. The study fell quiet again while snow drifted softly outside the tall windows. Somewhere upstairs, I heard faint footsteps moving slowly across the bedroom floor. Olivia, listening again perhaps, waiting, calculating. James stared toward Richard's old chair near the fireplace, his expression filled with something I had not seen from him in months. Doubt. Real doubt. Mom, he whispered eventually. I think I let Olivia shape too much of how I saw things after Dad passed away. That sentence mattered more than he realized. Because once someone begins recognizing influence, manipulation loses power quickly. Lily reached over and squeezed his hand gently while I remained calm, steady, observant. For the first time since Richard died, the balance inside this family had begun shifting again. And somewhere upstairs, I suspected Olivia could feel it happening. That evening, the atmosphere inside the house shifted in ways too subtle for strangers to notice, but impossible for family to ignore. Snow continued falling beyond the windows, soft and steady beneath the amber glow of Boston streetlights, while inside, every conversation carried tension beneath ordinary words. Olivia finally came downstairs just before dinner wearing a fitted cream sweater and dark slacks, her expression composed with almost unsettling precision. If she had been listening outside the study earlier, she showed no sign of it now. In fact, she looked calmer than usual, which unsettled me far more than anger would have. Manipulative people often become gentler once they realize control is slipping. Dinner smells wonderful, she said warmly as she entered the kitchen, glancing toward the roasted chicken resting on the counter beside fresh rosemary potatoes and green beans. I smiled politely while placing plates on the dining table. Richard's recipe, I answered softly. Olivia paused only briefly before responding. He always did love traditional things. Traditional things. Another carefully selected phrase that subtly reduced decades of family life into outdated customs. James noticed it too this time. I saw the shift immediately in his expression, the way his eyes lingered on Olivia with quiet uncertainty rather than automatic agreement. We sat together around the dining table while soft jazz played low from the speaker near the living room fireplace. Outside, the storm thickened again, coating the windows with delicate frost patterns. For several minutes, conversation remained surface level. Weather updates, traffic conditions, Lily discussing college applications. Yet beneath the calm, everyone at the table seemed aware of the same thing. The balance inside this family was changing. Halfway through dinner, Olivia finally set down her wine glass and spoke with practiced casualness. Actually, I have exciting news. Her voice carried that familiar brightness she often used before introducing ideas designed to reshape situations quietly in her favor. James looked immediately cautious. What kind of news? Olivia smiled beautifully, folding her hands together on the table. A luxury developer contacted me this afternoon about several Beacon Hill properties. The room grew subtly still. Lily lowered her fork without making a sound. I continued cutting my food calmly, though my attention sharpened completely. They are looking for homes with historical value and renovation potential. Olivia continued smoothly. Some properties in this area are selling for nearly triple market estimates now. There it was again, always returning to value. Investment. Opportunity. Never memory. Never legacy. James exhaled quietly beside her. Olivia, but she pressed forward anyway, her confidence slightly too eager now. I am only saying this because timing matters in real estate, especially for older properties that may become difficult to maintain over time. Older properties, she might ask. Well, have been speaking about me directly. I placed my fork down carefully and looked toward her across the candlelit table. You seem deeply emotionally connected to selling this house. The silence afterward settled heavily. Olivia blinked once before offering a small laugh. Margaret, I think you misunderstand my intentions completely. Do I? I asked softly. James stared down at his plate, while Lily watched Olivia carefully with open distrust now. For the first time since Richard died, the room no longer revolved automatically around Olivia's comfort. And she could feel it. Everything I suggest is for the family. Olivia replied, her smile tightening slightly. You say family often, I answered calmly. But every plan you make seems to involve removing the people who built it. That landed harder than I expected. Even James looked up sharply at that. Olivia's expression flickered for just a second before smoothing itself again. That is unfair. No, Lily said quietly before anyone else could speak. What is unfair is treating Grandpa's house like a business project. Olivia turned toward her immediately. Lily, adults are having a complicated conversation. Exactly, Lily replied softly. Which is why someone should finally say the honest part out loud. The room fell completely silent. Even the fire seemed quieter now. James rubbed one hand slowly across his face, visibly overwhelmed by the tension building around him. Olivia looked toward him immediately, expecting intervention, support, rescue. But something had changed inside my son over the past 24 hours. He no longer looked convinced. He looked conflicted. Olivia, he said carefully, maybe we should stop discussing the house for a while. Her eyes narrowed slightly despite the calm expression she tried maintaining. Why? Because your mother suddenly thinks I am manipulating everyone. James hesitated too long before answering. And in that hesitation, something important broke apart. Olivia saw it too. You believe this now? She asked quietly, genuine disbelief slipping through her polished composure for the first time. James looked exhausted. I think. He stopped, struggling with the words. I think maybe we pushed too hard. The silence afterward felt enormous. Outside, snow pressed heavily against the windows while the city beyond disappeared beneath white darkness. Olivia slowly leaned back in her chair, studying each of us carefully now, almost like a strategist reassessing a changing battlefield. And sitting there beneath the warm dining room lights Richard installed with his own hands nearly 20 years earlier, I realized something important. Olivia had spent years mastering influence inside this family because she assumed nobody would ever challenge her version of events directly. But once people begin speaking honestly, manipulation loses its elegance very quickly. Later that night, after dinner dishes had been cleared and the storm outside intensified again, the house settled into an uneasy silence that felt heavier than before. James remained downstairs in the living room staring absently into the fireplace, while Olivia disappeared upstairs without another word after the conversation at dinner. Lily helped me dry plates in the kitchen, both of us moving quietly beneath the warm overhead lights while snow pressed thickly against the windows. Grandma, she whispered carefully once James was out of hearing range. I do not think Olivia expected Dad to question her tonight. I folded a dish towel slowly between my hands. People who control situations often assume they control people too. Lily nodded thoughtfully, though concern still shadowed her face. Do you think she will stop now? I looked toward the staircase where soft light glowed faintly from the upstairs hallway. No, I answered honestly. People rarely give up control peacefully once they believe they deserve it. Around 10 o'clock, Lily headed home before the roads worsened further. I stood near the front door watching her car disappear slowly into the snowy Boston streets before locking the door behind her. The house became very still afterward. Only the grandfather clock in the hallway and the soft crackling of the fire disturbed the silence. When I entered the living room again, James remained seated near the fireplace with his elbows resting on his knees, staring down at the floor. He looked exhausted in a way that reached beyond simple stress. "Your father used to sit exactly like that when something was bothering him," I said softly. James gave a tired half-smile without looking up. "I think I understand him more now than I ever did before." I sat carefully in Richard's old chair beside the fire, the leather creaking softly beneath me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The glow from the Christmas lights reflected gently against the windows while snow drifted steadily outside, turning the city beyond into blurred white shadows. Finally, James exhaled heavily. "Mom, did you know all along?" I studied the flames before answering. I knew something felt wrong. But intuition and proof are not the same thing. He rubbed both hands slowly across his face. "I feel stupid." "No," I replied quietly. "You feel disappointed." That landed immediately because disappointment carries less shame and more truth. James leaned back against the couch cushions and stared toward the staircase. "After Dad died, I was barely functioning for months. Olivia handled everything. Bills, paperwork, schedules. She kept saying we needed structure. Structure. Another word that sounded healthy until it became control, disguised as organization. "She made me feel like I was drowning less," he admitted softly. I nodded slowly. "That is how influence begins sometimes. Through comfort." Upstairs, faint footsteps moved across the hallway floorboards again. Olivia was awake. Listening perhaps. Waiting. The entire house suddenly felt divided into invisible territories. James followed my glance toward the staircase and lowered his voice instinctively. "I do not know who she is anymore." I looked at my son carefully then. "No," I said softly. "You are finally starting to see who she has always been." Silence settled heavily between us again. Outside, wind rattled lightly against the old windows while the fire cast warm gold across family photographs lining the mantel. Richard smiling beside the sailboat he restored years ago. Lily as a little girl wearing oversized mittens during her first Boston snowstorm. James at age 10 holding a baseball trophy proudly in the front yard. Entire lifetimes preserved inside frames. Olivia never understood those photographs. She saw decorations. Richard and I saw proof of belonging. Suddenly, the upstairs hallway light switched off. A moment later, Olivia descended the staircase slowly, one hand resting lightly against the polished banister. She wore a silk robe over dark sleep clothes, her expression calm but unreadable. "I thought I heard voices," she said gently as she entered the living room. James straightened slightly beside the fireplace while I remained perfectly still in Richard's chair. Olivia glanced between us carefully, assessing the atmosphere with obvious precision. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. James hesitated before answering. "We were talking." Olivia smiled faintly. "About me?" There was no humor in the question despite the polished delivery. I noticed how carefully she watched James while asking it. "Not me. Him." Because Olivia understood something important now. The balance inside this family no longer tilted automatically in her direction. "We were talking about family," I answered calmly before James could respond. Olivia crossed slowly toward the fireplace, the soft fabric of her robe brushing against hardwood floors. "Family should support each other," she said quietly, "not turn suspicion into division." There it was again. Another elegant attempt to reposition herself as the reasonable one while framing honesty as conflict. James looked exhausted listening to it now rather than comforted. That difference mattered deeply. "Trust is not division," I said softly. "But manipulation creates distance eventually whether people admit it or not." Olivia's expression tightened almost invisibly around the eyes before smoothing itself again. "You truly believe I manipulated this family?" she asked. The room became completely still. Even the fire seemed quieter somehow. I held her gaze steadily beneath the warm Christmas lights glowing around the living room. Then I answered with the calm certainty only experience can teach. "I believe you wanted this house so badly that eventually you stopped seeing the people inside it clearly." Olivia said. "Nothing after that. Because deep down, I think she knew it was true." The next morning arrived clear and painfully bright after the storm, sunlight reflecting sharply across fresh snow and flooding the brownstone with cold winter light. Boston looked beautiful after heavy snowfall, almost unreal, as if the entire city had been polished overnight into silence. But inside the house, nothing felt peaceful anymore. The air carried the strange stillness that follows after hidden truths finally reach the surface. I woke early and found the downstairs empty except for the faint smell of coffee lingering in the kitchen. Olivia was already awake. I could tell immediately. Certain cabinet doors sat slightly open in ways they never had before, and the dining room chairs had been repositioned subtly, almost carefully. Tiny details. Richard always said people reveal themselves through the spaces they touch repeatedly. I moved quietly through the house wearing my wool cardigan and carrying a cup of coffee toward the living room. Through the tall front windows, I noticed James standing outside near the sidewalk with his hands shoved into his coat pockets, staring down the snow-covered street alone. He looked exhausted, older somehow. I watched him for several moments before hearing soft footsteps behind me. Olivia. He barely slept, she said quietly from the hallway entrance. Her voice sounded calm, but something underneath it had changed overnight. Less confident, more cautious. I turned slowly toward her. She wore cream-colored slacks and a fitted black sweater, her dark hair pulled neatly back, every detail composed as always. Yet for the first time since I met her, she looked uncertain standing inside this house. Neither did you, I replied softly. Olivia folded her arms lightly across her chest and glanced toward the front window where James remained outside. You turned him against me. I almost smiled sadly at that. No, I answered calmly. The truth simply became harder to avoid. The silence between us stretched heavily while morning sunlight reflected against the polished wood floors. Upstairs, the old pipes hummed softly as the heat circulated through the house. Olivia finally stepped farther into the living room, her expression tightening slightly. You think I am some terrible person because I wanted security. Security. Still hiding everything inside elegant language. I think you confused security with possession, I said quietly. Her jaw tightened for only a second before smoothing again. You have no idea what it was like growing up the way I did. There was something different in her voice now. Not manipulation exactly. Defensiveness. Real defensiveness. I remained silent, allowing her to continue if she chose. And surprisingly, she did. We moved constantly when I was a kid, she admitted softly while staring toward the fireplace. Apartments. Rentals. Cheap neighborhoods where nothing ever felt permanent. Her eyes moved slowly around the living room then. The bookshelves. The framed photographs. The Christmas decorations still glowing softly beside the tree. The first time James brought me here, I could not believe families actually lived like this. Her voice lowered slightly. Warm. Stable. Traditions. A home people stayed connected to for decades. I listened quietly while snow slid gently from rooftops outside. At first, I just wanted to belong here, she admitted. But eventually, she stopped speaking. Eventually what? I asked softly. Olivia looked directly at me then, and for the first time, there was no polished smile hiding behind her expression. Eventually, I became terrified of losing it. That honesty changed something inside the room instantly. Not because it excused anything, but because truth always sounds different from manipulation. So you tried controlling it, I said quietly. She lowered her eyes briefly. Maybe. The front door opened suddenly before either of us could continue further. James stepped inside carrying cold air and snowflakes with him. He paused immediately upon seeing both of us standing there together. The tension in his face returned instantly. Everything okay? He asked carefully. Olivia looked at him for a long moment before answering. Your mother and I were talking honestly for once. James removed his gloves slowly, clearly unsure what that meant. I walked toward the fireplace and rested one hand lightly against the mantel beneath Richard's photograph. Your wife finally explained something important, I said softly. James glanced between us cautiously while Olivia remained unusually quiet. Then, after several long seconds, she spoke again. I should not have pushed so hard about the house. The words sounded difficult for her to say. James looked genuinely shocked. Olivia. She shook her head slightly before continuing. No, your mother was right. Her voice trembled faintly now beneath the composure. I stopped seeing this place as your family's history and started seeing it as something I needed to secure for myself. Silence settled gently around all three of us, while morning sunlight illuminated the living room Richard spent decades building piece by piece. Finally, James exhaled deeply, almost like someone setting down a heavy weight after carrying it too long. He crossed the room slowly and stood beside me near the fireplace, staring at his father's photograph above the mantel. "Dad used to say home only works when people feel safe inside it," he murmured quietly. I nodded once. "And safety disappears when love starts feeling conditional." Olivia looked down at the floor after that. Not defeated exactly. Reflective perhaps. Outside, Boston traffic slowly returned to life beneath melting snow, while sunlight filled the house with warmth that felt genuine again for the first time in months. Standing there beside my son beneath the quiet glow of Christmas lights and decades of memory, I realized something important. Families survive betrayal more often than people think. What destroys them completely is silence. And once truth finally enters a home openly, even painful truth, healing becomes possible again.